NC pork, good for the plate, great for the state. Welcome into Timeout, the Tobacco Road basketball show here on the North Carolina Sports Network. I'm Mike Waddell, joined as always by DG David Glenn and the Coach Kerry Keating. A quick reminder that you can find everything we're building here at the North Carolina Sports Network at our website, ncsportsnetwork.com. You can also follow us on social at the NC Sportsnet on every one of our social platforms. Our YouTube page, again, at the NC Sportsnet. UNC's 2 losses on the left coast this past week. That road trip not going as Hubert Davis would have thought. On Wednesday night at Stanford, Carolina goes down 95-90. The Tar Heels building double-digit leads in both halves, but couldn't hold on. And then on Saturday in Berkeley, North Carolina dropped its second consecutive road game, losing 84-78 to Cal. Both of you watched these games that Carolina played. What stood out and how the Tar Heels went down both at Stanford and at Cal, DG?
Well, historically bad defense for 2 games for starters, and that continued an alarming trend for Hubert Davis because the Heels had given up, remember, almost 100 points in their loss at SMU. That is a very hard to defend Mustangs team. But they also gave up 84 to Wake Forest, which is not a particularly hard to defend team. Part of this issue is personnel related. Kyan Evans, who was at least temporarily replaced as the Tar Heels starting point guard when Hubert Davis elevated Derek Dixon into the starting lineup midway through that West Coast road trip. Kyan Evans is a junior, but he's only about 6'2", 175 pounds. So he can kind of be bullied physically. Luka Bogovac, the European import, is really kind of a step slow athletically at the ACC level, so that complicates defense. Jaden Young, the Virginia Tech transfer, really took a long time to grasp the way the Tar Heels like to play defense. So even though he shows flashes offensively, I think he at times has been part of the problem on defense. So it's part personnel, but it is part execution, right? I mean, everybody, we talked on our show last week about Abuka Okori being one of the best freshmen in the entire country. I mean, the Cal debacle was one thing because it was more distributed evenly among a bunch of scorers for the Bears. You knew it. I knew it. Hubert Davis knew it. The Carolina players were supposed to know it. Okori is a brilliant scorer. And yet, rather than complicating his journey against the Tar Heels, by the way, Duke did very well taking Okori out of the game plan when the Blue Devils hammered the Cardinal on their West Coast road trip. Instead, it was Okori scoring, Okori distributing, and the Tar Heels looking lackluster with their execution and with their preparation, really. This group of Tar Heels, remember, was pretty good on defense for most of the season. They had active hands on the perimeter. They had big guys like Henry Vessar and Caleb Wilson and Jaron Stevenson kind of lurking as shot blockers in support of the perimeter pressure defenders. But that has gone away in recent weeks. And it's central to Hubert Davis's job description and also the leaders on that team to get the Tar Heels back on track, especially with how they're defending right now.
Kerry, what makes January basketball tough for coaches here in the NIL era, and what's going through the locker room over there at North Carolina with the coaches? What are they talking about as they fly back across the United States and get ready for more big games this week with Notre Dame and Virginia?
Well, as DG referenced, not allowing your opponent to score an average of 90 points would be a great start. And that's the old adage, and how did they win the game when they scored more points? And let's get one thing out of the way. Although these are not terrible losses, they are losses that were probably winnable games. They're not nearly to the effect of quad 3, quad 4 like NC State just suffered at Georgia Tech. So can they overcome these? Yes. The how is really the more important part. And there was one possession in particular that stood out to me early in the Stanford game and watching the games. And You can try to dissect why other teams are scoring and why they're getting to this 90-point average. And obviously you can go through individuals who have career high games and schemes and cold and being on the road and so on and so forth. There was a transition defense or about midway through, if I recall correctly, in the first half where Caleb Wilson was back all the way to the rim, if you will, and his man was on the far right side of the floor as the ball came up the left side or vice versa. Well, the reason why I bring that up is because those responsibilities when you get back as a coach or for the first guy back are to take the basket first. You don't have a man in transition. You're guarding the ball. And he had the old problem of freshman mistakes of guarding a man and not the ball in a team aspect. Well, the ball ended up going right by him after it went by about two other guys. Let's not get it twisted. There's someone else responsible for stopping the ball if you're all the way back. And it made it all the way to the rim. And I didn't... It's not to dissect how they're playing this transition defense, but it was the reaction or the lack of reaction that kind of was alarming to me. Is that I kind of see that there's not a standard that's set for transition defense right now at this stage of the season. Now, if this was November, okay, you can maybe have some heads looking around what's going on. If it's December, maybe you have an upperclassman grabbing them and saying, hey, get to the spot, get to the spot. You're in January, and if there's no one on the floor, either your upperclassman or a teammate or a coach, or even yourself saying, oh, I know I'm supposed to be there, there's some sort of disconnect there. And I think if we really went back and broke down these last four games, I would almost guarantee that the breakdown from the coaching perspective in terms of what they're really dialing in on and having to get back to a focus on, if it isn't already, is their transition defense. It kind of goes without saying with the results saying that. When you go into the nuance of things that they can't control, it's not like they're incapable of doing it. They just did a very, very poor job of it. And the thing about Caleb that I point out is he's going to be at the point and at the back of that a lot, given the fact of his ability and his prowess on the defensive side if he's held accountable. It's obviously what he has on the offensive side. I think it behooves the staff to try to challenge him defensively, to try to step up on the defensive side and maybe make more of an impact.
David, when you look at Carolina so far this year, here in 2026, the Tar Heels are 1-3. They were 5-4 in January last year. What is it about January that seems to be getting Hubert Davis and this basketball program sideways over the last 2 years?
Yeah, I think it's different each year. I'm not necessarily convinced that it's a time of year as much of it as it is personnel-related issues. One bottom line for me with this Carolina basketball team, and I just wrote about it at ncsportsnetwork.com. The Tar Heels have championship caliber big men in Henry Vessar and Caleb Wilson, but they have lesser guards than they usually have. And the midseason indigestion was for one set of reasons a year ago, starting with personnel issues. The midseason indigestion this time is related to a different personnel issue, and it's really mediocre guard play. On an elite Carolina basketball team, if we watched UNC teams for our entire lifetimes, a Seth Trimble, who is a really athletic, hardworking, intense, amazing leaper and hardworking defender, and a leader for the Tar Heels in his fourth season in a Carolina uniform, he is Carolina's best guard this year. On elite Carolina basketball teams historically, a Seth Trimble type figure would be the third or fourth best guard on the team. And that's a personnel issue. That's a roster building during the offseason issue. So just as last year's team had certain personnel issues that had to be overcome and dealt with, this year's Carolina team has a different set of personnel issues. And when Carolina historically has championship caliber big men and just competent, capable guards, right? Derek Phelps was not a superstar point guard for the national championship Tar Heels in 1993 that were led by the big fella Eric Montross, rest his soul, and a forward named George Lynch. Phelps didn't have to be a superstar, but man, was he confident, was he capable, was he a hard-working defender, etc. And then Donald Williams became a hot shooter for the Tar Heels on the way to that championship event. Jimmy Black in 1982 for Dean Smith, right, was a just solid, reliable point guard. He wasn't a superstar. Other Carolina championship teams had great guards to go with good or great big men. this Carolina team has great big men, and we'll see how much better than mediocre guards. And it's up to that group of guards to get the best version of themselves and each other. And it's up to the former Carolina guard, Hubert Davis, to make sure that happens. Otherwise, the Heels have no chance to get where they want to go.
This roster construction thing, we've talked about it in football season with the Tar Heels. We're now talking about it in basketball season with the Tar Heels. Jim Tanner is the GM for basketball. And then we have Michael Lombardi over on the football side. Man, Carolina has the money. They can go out and buy whoever they need, but it doesn't seem like they're doing a really bang-up job in either of these general manager slots. Now, is it too early to say that this roster was not put together with maybe the 360 nature that we've seen from other teams around the nation, around the Atlantic Coast Conference?
I think it's going to be very easy for us to point to this for not just Carolina, but for a lot of teams whose expectations are outweighing their results, especially as we get closer to Selection Sunday and don't have a lot of teams showing up based on what they spent on their roster. This is a $14 million roster. This is a new way of thinking about how you're going about supporting your team, dissecting your team, figuring out who your team is, both from internal expectations and external, fan expectations as well. As David said, the only main rotation player back is Seth Trimble. And given where he might fit in on a historical roster is poignant, because if that's the case and you're secure in that knowledge as a staff, if the agreement is there, and I don't think there's much of an argument in that given the historical context that David brought up in the past guards they've had as far back as the 80s, what the Carolina system is about, it means you're building culture and defensive identity and communication basically from scratch with guys that have never really played together before. And it's not an excuse or a bailout, but it's an impetus for that front office to be in lockstep with not just the head coach but the staff from a short-term, medium-term, and hopefully in their case a longer-term development plan. And long-term could mean September to February. I'm not talking about 1 year to 3 years, because by and large, my guess is a lot of these GMs that are coming into college basketball now are really only looking at the low-hanging fruit of production on the obvious sense. Points, rebounds, assists. Maybe they get involved in some metric that they've created or is out there in the ether that can help justify one versus the other. And we're going to keep talking about this, Michael, because you know what we're doing at Layup. We are developing fit specific to your program. And I can't overemphasize this enough, how important this is in a short-term decision frame that has way larger consequences financially than ever before. You know, I look back after the Stanford game, and there were two quotes that stood out to me that kind of brought this to light in what we're talking about, Carolina and the roster. And Caleb actually was quoted, said they pretty much ran the same play every time down the court. You know, they brought the 3 and the 4-man up, and I think he said they just played isolation basketball. Now, he was quoted as saying that, right? So that quote was reiterated or regurgitated back to Hubert after. And he said, I respectfully disagree with that. So there's something like, there's some disconnect there at a fundamental level. And I'm using that as an example twofold. One, Carolina's got to get on the same page defensively, no doubt. But two, it's harder for uber talented kids that are getting paid millions of dollars to essentially score, to have to turn around and have a defensive responsibility at a level that professionals have been held to. The NBA pays guys to rebound and defend because they finally realized only a handful of guys can score, but those are important towards winning. College is like in a different stratosphere with this thought process right now. There isn't I'll give me any GM you want, randomly pick him out of a hat, throw a gun to his head and say, how many roster decisions did you make for your team and paid guys handsomely for to rebound, defend? None. That's the problem we're facing with right now. this transformative era of how to build rosters is not just about scoring more points. Yes, it's an important part. But when you have guys on that roster that are getting paid $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, you got to sit down and tell them in the beginning, we don't need you to score 10 points, 12 points. I need you to get 8 or 9 rebounds. I need you to be the guy guarding the other team's best player every night. I need you to make sure that you're aware of what we're doing in film so that we're connected. Like, those are the conversations I think you need to start having when you're building your roster. Not just throwing it together because you have this pool of money and all of a sudden people that want it. And we're going to get into how that's affected everything else now on a national level for the people that don't have it. But I think the people that do that, and some have, I mean, maybe a few have, are really going to thrive come March. We already talked about this. There are going to be monumental upsets based on point spreads that will not be upsets. And I brought Nebraska up as an example. There'll be a 20-point Elite Eight game, and people will be like, wait, what? How has that happened? Mark my words, it'll happen. And what will come out of it afterwards, the team that moves on is probably going to realize way back that they paid more attention to the little nuances of the roster building than their counterparts.
Hubert Davis, as a former Carolina guard, understands fit because he experienced it as a player in the college level, and he experienced it as a longtime player at the NBA level, and then he even experienced it as a broadcaster who was working for ESPN and able to see so many games and so many teams and so many backcourt fits in particular. One of the worst backcourt fits we've seen in recent college basketball history came at Carolina under Hubert Davis, when a really talented guy named Caleb Love, who, by the way, is tearing it up in the NBA right now to a degree that many didn't think was possible after having some success, obviously, at Arizona after leaving the Tar Heels. The R.J. Davis, Carolina legend, Caleb Love, future NBA double-digit scorer, those are two individually talented players. There's no doubt about it. And what R.J. did at the college level and what Caleb is doing at the NBA level underlines that they had unique high-level talents. Together, they mostly didn't work. And the Tar Heels were dysfunctional frequently as a result. That gets back to Coach's point and his company's purpose. Fit is different than talent. And, you know, there's nothing wrong with Seth Trimble being an athlete and a defender first, but not an elite scorer. But if you have built a roster where Seth Trimble, with all due respect to the guy, and I'm a fan of his, I enjoy interviewing him. I think he's a fascinating young man. I give him credit for being loyal to the Tar Heels for the entirety of his 4-year college career. Remember that number we dug up? There's only 3 guys in the entire 18-team ACC who are seniors this year at the same school they picked coming out of high school. 3 guys out of 18 teams, Trimble being one of them. But with all due respect to the young man and his wide array of talents, he is not well equipped to be the guard you ask to initiate offense late in the shot clock. Now, I've been covering college basketball for 40 years. I'm smart enough to see that. And that's as somebody who admires and respects Seth Trimble and his many talents. That's not what he does well. And if we lined up the guards at Carolina, since Hubert Davis was wearing that uniform at the end of the 1980s, there would almost always be, over that lengthy period, 1 or 2 or 3 guards who were better at initiating offense than what Seth Trimble has shown in late game, late half, end of shot clock situations. Can he do it sometimes? Yeah, he can. But you don't have to watch long to realize that's not what he does best. It wouldn't be on the list of the 5 things that he does best. But because of the way this roster is constructed, the Heels often ask him to do that. And that just seems to me to be setting yourself up for failure and maybe even setting yourself up for chemistry problems, because on some other Carolina teams, when they hit midseason adversity, they went sideways. Even other Carolina teams under Hubert Davis, when they hit midseason adversity, they got better and things turned out well. I don't know where this story is going to go, but some of these issues could have been foreseen during the offseason when this roster was put together.
It just seems like North Carolina, both in football and in basketball, and right now we're focused on basketball, but Kerry, David, both of you guys weigh in on this. It seems like everything around this men's basketball program under Hubert Davis, to me, has been very reactive. They wait for something to pop up. Maybe it's a personnel issue, maybe it's just a philosophical issue, but they wait on something to take place, and then they take their good sweet time in reacting to it. And it just doesn't seem like North Carolina is at the forefront of even the administrative side of college basketball. We're not talking about the guys on the court. We're not talking about the actual guys on the sideline, but just administratively, they're just not set up right to where we're still talking about roster construction when they came late to the game and hiring the GM before the ACC tournament a year ago. I mean, it just doesn't seem like they're ahead of the game, that they're being played more than they're playing the game.
So you can look on paper and say that regardless of when Tanner got to the party, Hubert got pieces, right? Got to be solid from Arizona. Obviously got Caleb locked up. You know, bringing in Jaron Stevenson, Kyan Evans, Luka. Hey, the roster on paper checks boxes. But here's the point and the difference in what's happening now. Building a roster isn't the same as building a team. It's very different. And these guys all came from different systems, different cultures, different expectations. And then you have your freshmen after a key road game saying they ran the same play every time, and then your coach turning around and saying, I respectfully disagree. It kind of tells you that you're missing some communication element there. You're missing a little bit of trust, some identity. And you may be able to go out and buy a roster. You can't buy the chemistry, right? It goes without saying. And there's 2 points I want to make to finish this up here. Unfortunately, although some guys are doing it mid-year, and this would be really next level, if they got a mid-year guy so they could portal their way to some defensive discipline. Let's go back and look at the success in 3 of the last 4 games. David's favorite point guard, Boopy Miller, 27 points. My guy from Wake Forest, Drew Carrots, 28 points. What could be our new guy here, Abuka Okori, 36 points. Why don't you go out and spend $500,000 on a guy that says, you know what, I don't know what you're going to need me to do anywhere else, but I'm not letting my guy score over his average or double it. I'm not letting 3 guys in a row score 27, 28, and 36 points. Now, I get it. It's not an individual sport. But if I was in high school right now, if I had my hands on kids in high school, I wouldn't be worried about them having a bag on offense. I'd be telling the guys even more so than we ever did before about how rebounding, you can make money rebounding. Well, how about right now in college you can make money if you portray yourself and prove yourself to be a defensive stopper. There is no one putting emphasis and pride on that. Nobody. And no one saying they got paid X amount of thousands, $100,000 to do it. And I think because, unless you're really next level going out and getting a mid-year guy who's in the G League who can do it, I think it comes down to the coaching right now. You do have the talent, but you've got to get some level of defensive discipline intact if you want to have a chance coming up here if you're Carolina.
DG, put a cap on this one for us. When should Carolina fans truly be worried about where this team is? Is it right now or is it down the line?
I still think the Tar Heels are an NCAA tournament caliber team. I still think the Tar Heels will have, more wins than losses in conference play. But their backcourt issues, personnel-wise and chemistry-wise, are very likely, in my opinion, to prevent them from being a great team. So I would just encourage Carolina fans not to jump off the bandwagon necessarily, but maybe recalibrate your expectations. Because the bottom line is, if you have championship caliber big men and a mediocre backcourt, you're going to be just another nice Carolina team. If that backcourt falls apart, you risk missing the NCAA tournament entirely. If the backcourt gets better, well, then you not only make the big dance, you have a chance of doing some damage once you get there. Carolina fans in many past years have been spoiled by, teams living up to high expectations. The modern Tar Heels just haven't had as many prep All-Americans. They haven't had as many future NBA stars. This team does have that in Caleb Wilson and a heck of a big guy in Vesar, but they need the guards to play better. Otherwise, we're going to be revisiting a version of this conversation every week.
Basketball nights in the bold North State? They're built on passion, tradition, and the best barbecue and bacon in America. Our pig farmers deliver the smoky, savory flavors fans love while contributing more than $10 billion to the North Carolina economy. So every time you crush a pulled pork sandwich at halftime or grab a crispy strip of bacon before tip-off, remember the farmers who make it possible. North Carolina pork, good for the plate, great for the state. Learn more at ncpork.org.
Back here on Timeout, the Tobacco Road basketball show on the North Carolina Sports Network. And we'll now shift our focus from the court to off the court. And last week, federal prosecutors in Philadelphia unsealed indictments charging 26 people in a sprawling point shaving and bribery scheme that allegedly affected more than 29 games across 17 Division I men's basketball programs dating back till 2022. Now, charges that were released here include bribery, conspiracy, and wire fraud, with payments in some cases reported between $10,000 and $30,000 per game. The indictment names more than 39 players who allegedly took part, including several current athletes from multiple programs nationwide, including somebody right here in the bold North State, a former North Carolina A&T Aggie named Kamian Shell, who is from Winston-Salem, indicted on those charges, including bribery and conspiracy related to this scheme. Now, I can tell you as a former AD, this is one of the things that really keeps you up at night, and that has only been exacerbated in the last few years as gambling has become more and more prevalent. Now, how lucky are we right here on Timeout to have both the former head coach to talk about how he goes to sleep at night trying to worry about stuff like this, and also a practicing attorney in David Glenn. So David, we'll start right here with you. You've read through this case. I mean, what does this really mean? Boil it down for the people right here in basketball-crazed North Carolina.
I think this was inevitable. And the reason I say that is that our world has changed pretty dramatically just in recent years. Not that gambling hasn't been around forever, and sports have been around forever, obviously, but a couple of things happened. One, the nature of gambling in our country changed, right? In-person sports gambling for a long time, at least if it was done legally, was done in the state of Nevada. So many of us have been to Las Vegas, had fun out there, and maybe placed some legal bets along the way. Meanwhile, college sports has become more of a subject of gamblers' money because more states allow in-person gambling, far more than Nevada nowadays. And of course, more and more and more states allow online betting. This explosion of betting is a relatively recent phenomenon. Unlike the professional leagues, like let's say the NBA and the NFL, which have really well-constructed security departments, where those folks are watching NBA referees, NFL referees, players. They're monitoring gambling companies. They have relationships with gambling companies. Imagine the challenge for the NCAA, which already has its hands full with lots of other problems that we discuss on this show and others. You have not just 30 or so teams, you have hundreds of teams. And oh, by the way, most of those players in the NBA and the NFL make enough money that they're less vulnerable to listen when an illegal gambler comes to them and says, hey, here's $10,000 if you'll do this, $30,000 if you'll do that. The NBA or the NFL guy is like, I'm not putting my life, my reputation, my money, my contract at risk for $10,000. Whereas even in the revenue sharing era, even in the name, image, likeness era, there are still plenty of athletes who do not make a lot of money. It's these guys in these indictments are not the superstar athletes taking $10,000. They're already making millions of dollars in modern college athletics. But there are so many more players, so many more teams, so many more avenues to legal gambling that something like this was inevitable. The only other thing I'll add quickly is that this is a sign that the system did work. How did these guys get caught? Well, if it's a random game in the middle of college basketball season, there are systems in place to detect unusually high levels of gambling on a given game or a player's statistics in a given game. That's what raises the red flags between the organization, the NCAA or the NBA, NFL, and the gambling community. They know what a typical game in Conference X draws in terms of who wins, who loses, prop bets, etc. And when those numbers start to mushroom or get exponentially bigger, red flags go up. If the red flags are investigated and they find scary preliminary information, sometimes you get the FBI involved, like here. These guys got indicted because they got caught, and now this gives coaches, compliance people, athletic directors, and others in the university setting more ammunition to go to their players and say, hey, if your morals or your ethics or some other reason doesn't prevent you from participating in this illegal activity, here's another thing for you to consider. This many dozen guys who wear college basketball uniforms are now at risk of going to prison because of what they got caught doing. So if your conscience didn't prevent you from thinking about saying yes, maybe these indictments will.
Kerry, we've seen feds go after players now. Last year, it was after guys on the coaching sideline. So what's going on right now if you're a D1 head coach and you're trying to run the program, you're trying to manage the portal, and you're also trying to coach these guys up? I mean, it seems like it's getting harder and harder by the day to be the head basketball coach.
It does cause more problems. It causes more problems that you have to attend to as the CEO of the program, the head coach. And whereas a lot of coaches ran out to get support to help build a roster or be a GM or be an offensive coordinator now, basketball defensive coordinator, they just bloated the staff. Not a lot of them apparently were able to get the most important thing, which was some protective level person that, like DG referenced, kind of exists. Well, it does exist at the professional level, the guardrails, because there's a lot to unpack here. Coaches are heavily involved in relationships and always have been in recruiting. Those relationships got compromised when social media made everybody accessible through direct message. Sometimes it was, hey, can I get your phone number? Can I get your email? Well, the sliding into the DMs became a whole phenomenon that made people accessible to anybody until they said no. And now you have this convergence of high major players literally getting six-figure deals and mid-major players looking across the street and going like, well, wait a minute. However, there's a commonality between those two still existing of not just AAU coaches, but now trainers. This is a real thing and become a little bit more prevalent now than even it was before as an underbelly component in the offseason, which, yeah, we kind of worried about as coaches, like who's in their ear telling them what to do as opposed to what we need them to do. You usually kind of flesh those out once I got back on campus. This is like an everyday thing now. And these trainers have created brands, personal brands, through social media growth and access and YouTube and Instagram that makes them more accessible to people that want access to what they have access to, whether it's a higher level player or maybe they were in the NBA or maybe they have so many hundreds of thousands of followers. There's a supposed financial ecosystem that's involved in that a lot of players and high school guys get fooled by. The reason why I bring it up is because they were the access point. They were the easy access point. They're trying to feed their families too. So it wasn't just delivering this money just for the players. There were what we would refer to as fixers back in the day, right? There were fixers involved. It's a very vulnerable ecosystem that was taken advantage of. I'm actually quite shocked it's not bigger than it actually is.
Yeah.
And it may be. It may still be. And the reason why we talk about it here is because it's here, it's home. It happened at North Carolina A&T. You know, one of those fixers, trainers is in Charlotte. One of the players is in Winston-Salem. Like, this isn't like happening in Texas or New York or Chicago. It's happening here, right? It's happening everywhere at all levels. And it may not be over just yet. So to answer your question, Mike, there's enough problems that coaches want to try to overcome or get ahead of. This is not one that, look, I'll be quite candid. Getting your kids together in a room and watching a 35-minute poorly produced video, don't bet on it, by the NCAA, thinking that that's going to carry weight and stop them from doing anything, in the larger scheme of things, it's almost like, okay, we checked the box. However, prior to 2020, which I think is going to become a huge inflection point for a lot of things as we talk about college athletics moving forward, you at least had a relationship with your kids, and there was a level playing field to where you were all there under the same premise, scholarships, right? Maybe you got a job off season, the whole deal, whatever. But it wasn't like kids were flaunting around bands, as I like to say, and stacks, real cash. And you would, if something was off, your players, you'd at least have a relationship enough with them that they would come say something to you. And you would tell them that. Hey, look, if some, and we always did this. I know I did. I'm sure a lot of coaches did. We either had a friend or a connection or someone who was in the FBI literally come in on top of the video and physically talk to the kids. It was way more impactful. And the whole thing is just about, look, if it doesn't smell right, it probably isn't. If it's not supposed to be, it probably shouldn't. You're not going to get in trouble for saying something. However, if you don't say something, the consequences are going to far outweigh whatever trouble you thought you were going to get into if something came up. And I just think not having that type of relationship with portal, transient, one-year kids, and who knows what they were exposed to at some of these other places, it's very, very difficult to get ahead of that as a coach. And I think as part of your staff, you really need to have someone fully dedicated towards that. Now, look, I'll say this. Like, I don't know how you stop an 11 to 12 to $13 billion train from coming down the tracks. Through almost the end of last year, sports gambling revenue nationally was up over 15% to almost $13 billion. I mean, that is a big train that you can't stop. You can't put on the cape and be Superman of that. And it's not to say you have to hop on that train or get ahead of it, but you better understand someone who's been a conductor before and get him involved in your program to get ahead of the red flags so that it doesn't take you down and stop you from doing what you're supposed to be doing. So the money's exploding, the protection isn't. It behooves coaches to try to, at least on their own farm, get someone who can take care of that aspect.
As long as huge amounts of money are involved and human beings are involved, bad things are going to happen eventually. What you have to try to do is what the NFL and the NBA and other professional leagues do, and that is monitor as much as you can, work with the gambling companies, look for these red flags, investigate when you get red flags, educate the athletes as much as possible. But the smartest approach in the history of the world is not going to eliminate this stuff. The recent headlines are a sign that when people are breaking the law, they are risking getting caught. So, I mean, you can go back and find, UNLV basketball players hanging out in hot tub with, Richard the Fixer, whoever, or even, a noble guy like John Wooden at UCLA. Some of his famous teams had famous boosters helping them out in all sorts of ways back in the day. Young people are going to listen if they can be talked into the idea, well, hey, we don't want you to throw the game necessarily in today's example. We just need you to have fewer than 6 assists so my guy can win his prop bet, right? Like they're just as the players from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s were vulnerable to hear, you're not really doing anything wrong, even though the NCAA says you're not allowed to take this money from me because I'm a booster. There's a 2026 version of that same thing going to the guy who says, we don't want you to necessarily lose the game. We'll just give you 30 grand if you'll make sure that this specific statistic falls either on the over or on the under, because that's where all of our guys are going to bet it. So again, I wouldn't get depressed over the state of college athletics simply because bad things are happening. Bad things are going to happen. And it's just a question of what can the NCAA do, what can the individual schools do to minimize the risk and to maximize the chance of people getting caught if they choose to go down these roads.
In college sports, the teams that win aren't always the most talented. They're the most organized. They study the film, they build the game plan, and they execute with clarity and purpose. Your life works the same way. At Organize for Success, productivity expert Emily Parks helps busy leaders create championship-level systems for work, family, side projects, and everything in between. For more than a decade, she's coached clients to prioritize what matters most and eliminate the chaos that slows them down. If you're ready to run your life with the same precision as a top program, visit organizeforsuccess.com and set up your complimentary call. Organize for Success. Win the day. Every day.
Some places don't just serve food. They feel like home. That's the Original Saltworks on Oleander Drive in Wilmington, owned and operated by Bob Hubbard, and part of the daily rhythm of the Wilmington Beach community for decades. It's the kind of place where breakfast turns into lunch, conversations last a little longer, and the menu feels familiar. Eggs fixed your way, grits or hash browns, omelets, waffles, and cinnamon French toast. Then there are the lunches people come back for: homemade chicken salad, crab cake sandwiches, and classic burgers. They're open 7 in the morning through 3 in the afternoon at 6301 Oleander Drive. The Original Saltworks. Good food, good people. Just like home.
Final overtime segment for this week's edition of Time Out, the Tobacco Road Basketball Show. Let's go around the Big Four with Coach Kerry Keating and David Glenn and get their thoughts about these 4 basketball programs and the week ahead. And Kerry, let's start out in Winston-Salem with Steve Forbes and Wake Forest. And David, you comment on the backside of Coach's comments. What do each of you expect for the Demon Deacons in the week ahead? What do the fans need to be on the look for?
Well, they're going to have to solidify a lot of things to make sure they're in a position to be in a position, right? We've talked about how they're always kind of on the cusp, maybe there, but haven't showed up and haven't been able to kind of break through and get to the NCAA tournament. Defensive rebounding, transition defense, these 2 things can translate into wins come February, late January, February. And then as we've talked about before, obviously the aforementioned Juke Harris having a great season and not too unexpected, but who's going to take ownership for them in late in games? I mean, these are the stalwarts of programs that haven't kind of broken through that they need to establish. Their defensive identity, transition-wise, their rebounding ability, and who's going to take ownership late in games for them when they actually just step up and win one.
Yeah, a couple quick things on that. One, shout out to the senior point guard and incoming transfer, Nate Calmise. He took the bull by the horns, and when that game was in jeopardy of getting away against Florida State, and you could almost say the Demon Deacons' season was fragilely hanging in the balance, he got that game-winning bucket on the road at Florida State. It would have been 5 losses in 6 games for the Deacs if Calmise had not come up with some game-saving and then eventually game-winning plays down the stretch. And we all know the bottom line here for Wake Forest in mid-January is they need big wins. And earlier this season, they had chances and they did not deliver. This week alone for the Deacs provides for a home game against SMU on Tuesday and a road trip to Duke on Saturday. Now, nobody would expect them to go to Durham and beat the top 5 Blue Devils head-to-head. But at home, Wake actually has one of the better records in the nation in recent years in front of all the friendly fans at the Joel. SMU's a dynamic offensive team, but if you want to view yourself as a potential NCAA tournament participant, you have to get some of these. And again, I don't expect you to go to Duke and beat Duke. But SMU at your place this Tuesday, that's a chance. It's an opportunity. Later, the Deacs have NC State in Winston-Salem. They have Louisville coming to Winston-Salem. They have Stanford and Clemson both coming to Winston-Salem. Those latter games are a little bit down the road. But you have no chance on Selection Sunday unless you can point to 4 or 5 best wins that are worthy of making you a legitimate candidate. And right now, Wake simply does not have that resume. They need to change that resume and fast, starting this week with those 2 opportunities against the Mustangs and the Blue Devils.
2 games for the North Carolina State Wolfpack this week to get back on the winning side of the ledger after dropping the home game to Georgia Tech this past weekend. The Wolfpack on the road at Clemson on Tuesday night and at Pitt on Saturday. David Glenn, this is the time of year where I know Will Wade is looking for that consistency to come to the red and white.
Yeah, the bottom line here is NC State has maybe 7 or 8 games left in the regular season to prove that this Wolfpack is an NCAA tournament caliber team. We can look at the talent that Will Wade has assembled and observe, well, they look like an NCAA tournament team. I would like a group that includes Darian Williams and Quadir Copeland and Paul McNeil and Matt Abel, the star freshman off the bench, and our friend Van Allen Lubin in the post. I mean, that's a heck of a nucleus. That to me sounds like an NCAA tournament team. But we know that on Selection Sunday, they don't have conversations like that. They don't throw out bouquets because Will Wade's top 5 players look like they form an NCAA tournament worthy unit. The bottom line is that NC State had 6 games in the non-conference schedule to prove who they are in a good way. They lost 5 of the 6. They beat VCU, and I'm convinced that's going to be a nice cherry on top of the resume if it ends up being a close call. But they lost to UVA in conference play. They lost to Kansas, Auburn, Texas, and Seton Hall. 4 missed opportunities in non-conference play. You mentioned the trip to Clemson. Tigers are not overwhelmingly talented, in my opinion, but their record sure looks good, and they're near the top of the ACC standings. NC State also has trips to SMU, Louisville, and Virginia in February. Any one of those on the road would be a power-packed quad 1 style victory. They have home games in February against Miami and UNC. Those are more opportunities to just bolster your resume. Duke, I think, visits in early March. So there's 7 or 8 remaining games that carry heavy weight when it comes to how the Wolfpack's resume is going to be viewed on Selection Sunday. Again, they have the talent to do it, but when the last thing in your mind is that Georgia Tech loss, you start to wonder whether they're going to do it.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, and I know Will has been referencing this and did reference the Georgia Tech loss as now they have a blemish. They were pretty clean before that, even though they didn't have anything to stand up for it in quad 1. Well, let's expand on that more. As DG just laid out, they're most likely at the end of the season going to have anywhere between, depending on some teams rising, falling, I'd say 14, maybe 15, potentially 16 quad 1 games. If they don't have 5 wins in quad 1 at least, they're not getting it. I mean, it's just the bottom line, because that'll obviously move and adjust accordingly. However, all the reasons for why they get there, and the one thing that I'll pull out is when I watch them and Darian Williams struggles or lack thereof, production notwithstanding, I don't know if they have an offensive identity right now that travels on the road. And I think it'll come up in these road trips that I think DG just pointed out. They have 2 big quad 1 road games coming up. I'm not sure that their offense is reliable right now. I think there's a defensive identity that can maybe keep them in games. It's a little bit of a flip what we referenced earlier in the show. I'm just not crazy about their offense right now. And I think they need to shore up some things to make sure that they can get themselves where they need to be to turn those 16 or 17 quad 1 opportunities into at least 7 or 8 wins.
After playing 2 games last week in California, the Duke Blue Devils have only 1 game this week, and it's not until Saturday at home against the Wake Forest Demon Deacons. This is one of those Big Four rivalry series games, David Glenn. Everybody's excited about Big Four play coming up, and I know for Duke, John Shire is really going to get the most out of his team by probably backing off on the practice a little bit this week and getting some rest as they head into a pretty big stretch coming up, not only with the Deacs this weekend, but then Louisville and Virginia Tech next week.
Yeah, obviously Duke at 17-1 is the class of the ACC, as is often the case, and one of the best teams in the entire country. I will say this about the Blue Devils in a theme that we will revisit in the coming weeks and months. When I watch other really good national teams, some of them are imbalanced between offense and defense. For example, in the SEC, Alabama is off the charts offensively, but I sometimes wonder if the Crimson Tide can get enough stops when they need them. In the Big Ten, Tom Izzo's group at Michigan State, off the charts defensively. I sometimes wonder if the Spartans are going to be able to get the clutch bucket, execute late in the shot clock often enough to truly be great, not just good, but great in the end. I bring those up because Duke is incredibly well balanced right now between offensive efficiency and defensive efficiency. And when we get to the NCAA tournament and try to coach people up on their bracket picks and all that stuff, I'll remind folks there is no better predictor of postseason success than the rare combination of top 10 offensive efficiency, top 10 defensive efficiency on the same team. There are a bunch of teams in this country that are great at one or the other. As we speak, there are 4 teams in the entire country that are top 10 offense, top 10 defense, to use one set of metrics, kenpom.com. It's Michigan, it's Arizona, it's Duke, and it's Gonzaga. That's the whole list. And the Blue Devils were already really good when they left on that West Coast trip that you mentioned to play Cal and Stanford in those back-to-back games, whereas the Heels came away 0-2, the Devils came away 2-0. And their only loss, remember, was by a single point to a quality Texas Tech team. Then they take this 5,000-mile recent road trip. That's what it is, round trip. They actually got better while sweeping the Bears and the Cardinal in dominant fashion. They played great team defense against Cal. Isaiah Evans, one of our keys to the Duke season, scoring support behind or beyond National Player of the Year favorite Cameron Boozer. Isaiah Evans had 17 in support of another big game for Cam Boozer in that Cal game. And Nick Hymenia off the bench actually had 10 points and 4 rebounds. That was good to see. Then against Stanford, the Devils had a great game plan for the Cardinals' star freshman guard, Abuka Okori, who tore up the Tar Heels with 36 points. Duke had a plan for him collectively. Duke had a plan for him individually. He had 9 points, 9, in another superb defensive performance by the Devils, with Malik Brown being his typically brilliant self at the end, at that end of the floor. And again, Isaiah Evans was the reliable second scorer in that Stanford game, 15 points. Cam Boozer continues to be the best player in the entire country. He continued to get better, as the team did during that West Coast road trip. And that's a great sign with Louisville coming to Durham soon, followed by some closer to home road trips for the Blue Devils as they head to Virginia Tech at the end of January. That can be a challenging game. And then they have that trip down the road to Chapel Hill in early February. Who knows what those two teams will look like by then?
If you're John Shire, what are you doing this week, Kerry? Are you practicing with the week off? Are you giving some time off to the guys and really starting to focus in on a self-scout and maybe some evaluation heading into that lone game of the week on Saturday against the Deacs?
Well, as David eloquently pointed out, there isn't a lot of self-scout that has to be done. I think this team has clearly defined roles and really good balance. The numbers certainly support that, and being top 5 in both offense and defense efficiency. And as David said, one of only 4 in the top 10, with a few lurking in the 11-12s on both sides that could creep up and join that group for potential contenders at the end of the year. I think they have a pretty well-defined defensive identity. They seem to be comfortable winning in different styles. They obviously have right now someone who might end up being player of the year in the country, as a freshman. They're getting everything that they need out of what they need. And I think this week comes at a time where it's about physical rest more than anything else. Mental sharpness, a lot of reps, maybe getting some of those role players a little bit more refined and defined and strengthened, which is a dangerous thing if you're coming up against Duke here soon, given the success that they've had right now. I think this is a team right now that looks like they know who they are, and they're going to look in the mirror and be confident in that, and they're just going to want to go get a haircut and make it look a little bit cleaner this week so that when they come out of that salon next week, they're looking even better than they do right now.
Final word here on the Big Four with North Carolina. The Tar Heels with games this week against Notre Dame at home on Wednesday night, on the road at the John Paul Jones Arena in Charlottesville on Saturday against Coach Odom and the Cavaliers. Guys, we talked about the Tar Heels. We know where they are right now, but where they are is with 9 teams above them in the current ACC standings. If Carolina, David Glenn, loses one of these games this week, they're going to still be under 500 as we close into late January in the ACC. That seems stunning to me.
Yeah, I'm with you on that part. And this week is going to provide some interesting challenges. I'll be watching the UNC coaching staff for a different set of reasons that I'll be watching the players' execution. I've always thought, and I always defer to Coach Keating on matters like this, but I've always thought, just as a journalist, as an observer, as an athlete myself back in the day, one of the greatest message any coach can send is with how he distributes playing time, right? And I'm going to be fascinated, given the problems in the backcourt that we have described with the Tar Heels. How does Hubert Davis distribute minutes among Derek Dixon, freshman point guard who just got promoted to starting point guard? That's a message in itself. Will that continue? What's Kyan Evans' role if he's no longer in the starting lineup? How about Seth Trimble? How about Jonathan Powell off the bench? How about Jaden Young off the bench? How about Luka Bogovac? You know he's going to be emphasizing defense in practice, Hubert Davis, for obvious reasons. And those guys are going to have to scratch and claw and earn their minutes. And it'll be fascinating to see how those minutes are distributed in this week's games and also beyond. On the players' side, I'll be watching attitude, effort, and execution. Because when you hit adversity, it tests your fiber. And either guys are in the locker room pointing fingers at each other, or they're truly collectively together and they're willing to work through their problems with positive attitudes. And actually, it's a shame in one sense, maybe a break for the Tar Heels. Notre Dame would have been a fascinating challenge for Carolina because by far their best player is their all-ACC guard, Marcus Burton. Well, he's been hurt. He's missed, I think, 10 games in a row or something like that. So rather than it being, can you defend Marcus Burton smarter than you defended or failed to defend Abuka Okori, the obvious guy on your Stanford scouting report? So they may not get that opportunity, obviously, because of Burton's injury. But the game at Virginia, I mean, the Heels will be a significant underdog. That is a really well-run offense at UVA under Ryan Odom. So they have their hands full in that UVA trip. But I'll mention one last thing. There's only 5 teams in Carolina basketball history whose leading scorer was a true freshman. Caleb Wilson will be that for the Heels this year. He's example number 5. All 4 of the previous examples were roller coaster rides for Carolina. And I'm talking about, you could say in 100 plus years of UNC basketball history, or you could say since freshmen were declared eligible, way back in the 1970s. That's a lot of years. And there's only 5 examples of a true freshman leading the Tar Heels in scoring. One of those previous 4 examples, the high-scoring freshman was Rashad McCants. And that team was a train wreck. They had an inexperienced head coach in Matt Doherty. Rashad McCants could be, I would say, giving him the benefit of the doubt if I described him as one of the most volatile, unpredictable personalities in the history of UNC basketball. That would be the nicest way that I could say it. The combination of the inexperienced and volatile head coach Matt Doherty and the bizarro land personality Rashad McCants on that freshman-led team in scoring, it was a disaster and an absolute train wreck in 2003. When Tyler Hansbrough was the rare Carolina freshman leading the team in scoring, and a Hall of Famer named Roy Williams was the head coach, guess what? They weren't a perfect Carolina team by any stretch. It was 2006, but they stuck together through adversity. They played hard. They rode Tyler Hansbrough as hard as they could. They finished second in the ACC. They made the NCAA tournament. It is not mere coincidence that the fragile freshman-led Carolina team of 03 with the inexperienced head coach and the volatile personality as the leading scorer, McCants, face planted, and that other one, under similar circumstances, only Hansborough's personality, as hardworking and relentless as it gets, and Roy Williams as the calm Hall of Fame hand to steer the ship. They weren't an elite team that year, but they made the tournament, finished second in the ACC, and that same freshman class actually ended up winning the national championship 3 years later in 2009. So that's how fragile this precipice is at Carolina right now. It's great to have a spectacular freshman like Caleb Wilson, but every time Carolina has had a leading scorer who was a true freshman, it has been a wild ride, and I don't think this year is going to be an exception in that regard.
This is the North Carolina Sports Network. From the high country to the Outer Banks, on courts, fields, and fairways, we tell the stories of the bold North State. Follow us on social media at the NC Sports Net. We're the exclusive home of The David Glenn Show, coach-driven analysis of football and basketball. A look at the past with This Was Then, Inside NIL with Court Vision, the North Carolina Sports Awards, aka the Pineys, and the Old North State Tailgate, where we are on the ground at North Carolina's top events. Our foundational partner is NC Pork, raising the bacon, raising the bar. Telling the stories of the bold North State. Experience matters. This is NCSN, the North Carolina Sports Network.